Good morning. I see we have some people joining us already. We are going to get started in about 60 seconds. While we're waiting, please take a moment to answer the poll question on your screen. And thank you to those who have already started answering the question. It helps us kind of guide today's event. And come up with some other questions for our wonderful speakers at the end of the event today. Okay, I know we have some other people joining, but we are going to kick off today's event. Welcome to How Software Will Transform and Accelerate the Supply Chain Decarbonization with Schneider Electric. My name is Jessica Hunt. If this is the first time that you're joining us, thank you so much for being here. We truly appreciate you spending part of your day with us this morning. And during today's event, all attendees have the ability to chat with each other, as well as submit questions for Vishnu and Dave. They will be taking questions at the end of the event. If we do not get a chance to answer your specific question during the event today, their team will follow up with you as soon as possible. One of the questions that we get throughout our webinars is whether or not the slide deck will be available for attendees. The answer to this question is yes. It will be sent in a follow-up email from Schneider after the event. So don't feel like you need to take notes. Enjoy the presentation and submit as many questions as you would like to. At this point, I am going to turn the presentation over to Vishnu, and I will rejoin Vishnu and Dave for the Q&A at the end of their presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, or like the Australians would say, good day, everyone. My name is Vishnu Nair. I work with at Schneider Electric, specifically in a part of Schneider that's known as Zygo. I lead two of the Zygo products that are focused on supply chain decarbonization and sustainability management. Been with the company for 13 years, a little icebreaker, I guess. I love to read, as you can tell from the background. That is, in fact, my real background. And if you were wondering, no, I have not read all of those books. Unfortunately, I buy books faster than I can read them. So someday I will catch up. But yeah, that's me. I'm going to let Dave introduce himself next.
Thanks, Vishnu. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Dave Rimkus from Schneider Electric. I have been with Schneider for nearly 2 decades now. Majority of my background is in procurement, supplier development, manufacturing strategy, operations, plant procurement. I now lead our overall supply chain decarbonization programs here at Schneider Electric and working for our sustainability business. And I am located here in sunny, somewhat rainy today, Nashville, Tennessee. So pleasure to be with everyone today and look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Vishnu.
Thank you, Dave. Right, so we're gonna get started. So as you know, we're here to talk about the difference that software can make to supply chain programs, and specifically how it can accelerate your supply chain program. But before we start, let's start at the beginning, right? So I understand that we're in a landscape, specifically with sustainability, where there's a lot of change happening. Maybe the official label of this particular set of activities might change, but the fact remains that the momentum for this type of prioritization is still strong in the boardroom. And that's true even at Schneider Electric. So I want to introduce the fact that Schneider Electric as a company has been in the top ratings of the Gartner supply chain for a decade or so, roughly now. As a company, we have a manufacturing presence, we have a service-oriented offer as well, and we have software as well. So when we see data like this that says 50% of boardrooms look at tying compensation structures to sustainability, or the fact that the number 2 priority for chief procurement officers is sustainability. When we see that data, we definitely align with it. We understand it. We practice it as well, right? So this still remains strong. Large corporations as well as medium-sized corporations are still looking at sustainability and what they can do to improve their performance in this particular metric. And of course, within that overall domain of sustainability, scope 3 and specifically supply chain is a critical element for a lot of the companies that come to us looking for help. So within that context, what specifically are the challenges that companies that embark on a supply chain program or a scope 3 reduction strategy are likely to see? So from the data that you're looking at here, this is data from IBM as well as Deloitte based on surveys they did a year ago, where they interviewed C-level executives at multiple global companies to try and understand what are the challenges that you face if you decide to do scope 3, and how far along have you come in your scope 3 journey, right? So when you look deeper into that data, what you see is that pretty much everyone is deciding to do something about supply chain decarbonization or scope 3 reduction, right? That's what you see here. But almost all that start that ambition or that journey quickly realize that it's challenging, which is why 86% of them have reported challenges in measuring scope 3. Now, remember, this is just specifically scope 3. When you start doing your sustainability management, there's obviously scope 1 and scope 2. And statistically, I'm not saying it's easy, but statistically, it's easier of a challenge to manage your scope 1 and scope 2 than it is scope 3. Because when it comes to scope 3, you're in effect looking to influence without authority, because it's about your value chain and you don't necessarily have direct control over your value chain like you do with your scope 1 and scope 2. So you run into challenges. And the most common challenge is the access to data. And as a result of that lack of data from your scope 3 or from your supply chain, what we see is that a big percentage of the companies that decide to do something about scope 3 struggle to report the data or the progress on scope 3. So very few of them get to a position where they're ready to report on scope 3. And as a result, the quick reaction that seems consistent across the board is that they're all looking to digital tools for help, because they understand that there's a certain scale involved with large supply chain programs, the sheer number of suppliers and problems that you're going to be dealing with. They realize that to achieve that scale, you're going to need software assistance. So that brings us to the question of, okay, so then how can software help, or why do these companies think that software can help, right? So let's look at how that's possible. So when you look at software, there are ways in which you can use software for individual pieces of your overall supply chain program, and each section there is a way in which software can help, right? So the first challenge that companies face is that there's a training challenge, where when you approach your suppliers to talk about supply chain programs and net zero programs, they don't know what you're talking about. And that right there is going to be the first challenge that most companies face, where you're going to have to educate your suppliers, bring them up to speed about what is sustainability. Some of them may not even understand why the connection exists. They might ask the question of, wait, why do you care about my electricity consumption? That's my electricity consumption. I don't understand, right? So there's definitely an education element involved, where you need to bring your suppliers up to speed and educate them on sustainability and scope 3 and the link between your value chain and them as suppliers sitting in the value chain, and how that connection exists, and all of that. And software can definitely help with this, especially if you're looking at a supply chain program with a large number of suppliers, because it's a different thing if it's just you and your 5 favorite suppliers. Maybe you can just have a phone call. But if you're looking at a large supply chain program, right, you're looking at scale, and that's where software can truly help deliver that education to your suppliers. The second piece is that the data, as I mentioned earlier, is not available. When you start a supply chain program, there's a lot of excitement. This is a very common situation that we run into very often is a company launches a supply chain program, a net zero program. There's a lot of excitement from your value chain. They may even volunteer without even being asked to participate. And so there's this big groundswell of excitement at the announcement. But then when it comes time for action to start and you start sending out those questionnaires or surveys, asking the questions of what are your emissions, scope 1, scope 2, what are your plans, things like that, that's when you might start to see some radio silence, right? And if you were to reach out to these suppliers, what they would tell you is, and this is based on direct experience from customers as well as situations we've been in, where the suppliers are going to go, look, you're a big company, you're X%, 10, 15% of our overall revenue, you've asked for this information or you've suggested that we should participate in this net zero program. Of course we're going to, we're not going to say no. But what happens is a lot of supply chain programs have this dynamic where suppliers, especially small and medium-sized suppliers, are signing on with the expectation that even though they don't know what to do in net zero programs or how to reduce their emissions, they're hoping that you, the owner of the supply chain program, will help them. So there's very much a dynamic of, I have no idea what this means, but I'm sure they do, right? And so you will have that dynamic in your supply chain program. And the other dynamic is not just that, hey, they're going to give me direction on what to do. There's also an expectation that they might give me the tools. Because they're the ones that want the information, so surely they'll give me the tools to generate that information, right? So there's a lot of that that happens in many supply chain programs. And another aspect of supply chain programs that are unappreciated is when you typically announce a supply chain program or you're kind of planning and speaking to your suppliers, the people that you're speaking to on the other side of the table are likely to be, relationship managers or salespeople who, let's just say, they want to say yes, right? And so if you were to go to a supplier and say, hey, I'm going to do this large supply chain program, are you interested? Chances are they'll say yes, even if they don't know what they're saying yes to, right? So with almost every supply chain program, this is pretty common, which is why, again, we come back to the software story, where when you start that supply chain program, if you were to set it up with software that explains what all this is about, that explains sustainability, that makes it easier for them to speak about it internally as well as externally, then you're more likely to get engagement from suppliers. And then, of course, the next part is that you need data from them, right? And so even for that data, software can help. But let's stay on education for a second. So exactly how can education help your suppliers? So when you start a global supply chain program, you have different suppliers in different parts of the world may have different options on the table for them to reduce their emissions. So the first part of education is explaining what sustainability is, providing that sustainability 101 type content, and then also informing them on the specifics of their region, that, hey, you're sat in a region where wind and solar energy is easily accessible. You should really consider it. And there needs to be content that explains that to them. Or you might have suppliers that are sat in regions where it's not that easy to access green energy, in which case, what else can they do, right? So you can't have a one-size-fits-all type solution, especially if it's a global supply chain program. So that scale and complexity can be handled by software, which looks at where are these suppliers located, what are the options available to them, and what actions should they consider to undertake on their own, right? And remember, a supply chain program is going to have companies or suppliers of all sizes, right? So for some of your suppliers, it may be enough to just educate them, because these are large, capable companies. If you just tell them that, hey, these are your options, they have enough capability to take that and run with it. But depending on the supply chain program, you may also have a significant portion of small and medium-sized enterprises sat in your supply chain program. And for those companies, it's not going to be enough to just give them the education of, hey, here's what sustainability is, here are your options, good luck, right? You will have to do more. You'd have to give them the tools to calculate the emissions. You're going to have to give them the tools to understand what actions they can take. And you're also going to have to nudge them towards that action. And there as well, software can play a role, because without software, you wouldn't be able to cover that aspect of your value chain, right? So when we say software can transform our supply chain program, primarily it's about making the data easy to access, and improving the quality of the data by providing a consistent piece of software that collects the data from all your suppliers. So if you are using supply chain decarbonization software from your large suppliers, you should be able to get the information about what are your emissions, and so on. And then from your small and medium-sized enterprises as well, the ones that don't know how to calculate that number, you will still be able to get the information from them because the software would make it that easy for them to provide that data. So I want to emphasize that aspect of it a little bit. When you have a big supply chain program, consistency is very key to the quality of your data. If you take the approach of, hey, these 10 are going to give me an Excel file, those 25 are going to send me a Word document, and these 3 will just send me an email, your data quality is going to be unusable, right? And you shouldn't be surprised if you have carbon footprint emissions of 1, and things like that, right? And so there's a big benefit in having the same consistent platform collect the information so that all the information is collected in a consistent manner, calculated in a consistent manner, and presented back to you in a consistent manner so that you can then report it upwards, right? So it's really helpful to have good software in your supply chain program. Now, I kept saying good so far, good software, but what can really make the software great is if it remembers, or if it keeps the focus on the second pain point that most supply chain programs run into, and that is the action. Because with most supply chain programs, as you can see from the survey data as well, what most people are obsessed with is the first wall they run into, which is the data wall. I have no data. The data that I get is not usable, and the data that I get is not of good quality. That wall is the first wall that you'll run into, and that's what most people are focused on solving for. But it's easy to get distracted and think that that's the only challenge that you're going to have. Once you solve the data problem and once you get those numbers, then everything else becomes about, right, that's the number. How do we get it down? How do we make that number go down, right? So there's a big piece of action. And that distinction between focus and action and focus and data is the difference between good software, good supply chain software, and great supply chain decarbonization software. Because I would argue that good supply chain decarbonization software would give you awesome data. It would solve the data problem for you hands down. But what makes software great is if beyond the data problem, once the data is taken care of, does it actually help your suppliers reduce their emissions? And so specifically for your small and medium-sized enterprises that may require that support, you're going to have to provide them the support of, here's how you calculate the emissions. The software will help them with that. Here's a plan based on the information that you gave us. Here's what you can do to reduce your emissions. And then maybe also connect them with companies that can reduce the emissions for them. That it would be what makes great supply chain decarbonization software, because now it's taking care of both your problems of data as well as action. Right. So that I think is a good summary of the big difference that good and great software can make in your supply chain program. I'm now going to hand it over to Dave, who's going to go through some examples of such supply chain programs that you could learn from. Dave?
Yeah, thank you, Vishnu. I kind of want to chime in there a couple times on some of the things that you were mentioning. I think when we talk about software, the suppliers that we're working with today, and I'm going to walk through a few examples, as you can see in the screen here, some real life examples of some of the programs that I'm deeply entrenched in, my team is deeply engaged with today, and kind of share some context, some lessons learned, what we're hearing out there in the market with suppliers. But one of the things really that is a huge pain point that Vishnu talked about was that data collection piece up front, right? Really, some of the large multinational clients that we work with today really don't know the right questions. They've set goals, right? They've set scope 3 goals around certain things with certain dates, but they really don't have that glide path to help meet those goals. And you could probably be looking at yourselves in the mirror right now and be like, yeah, that's me. There's a lot of us out there that don't have that glide path specifically to help meet those goals for our supply chain, or even where to start. How to scope our suppliers, where to identify our hotspots, how do we really start creating that glide path to help them reach that goal? So software is going to be absolutely key in order to do that. And I can walk through some of the programs that talk about that as we see, but the supplier data collection is key. A lot of companies out there are doing a very nice job today of that data collection piece, and being careful not to reinvent the wheel. We talked about simplicity, streamlined communication, communicating with suppliers that are in your bill of materials or in your supply chain of an end in mind or value prop. Really, why are we doing this, right? So the fatigue is absolutely real. We talk to within our programs today. We personally onboard suppliers and have 30-minute conversations with them to understand where they're at in their journey. What pain points are they feeling? We've heard some small, medium-sized businesses really raise their hand and say, Dave, I'm getting hit 30 to 50 different times a year on different ESG metrics, different decarbonization levers, education, engagement. Right now, COVID's beyond us, but we're coming out of that crisis, getting back up to speed on normal business levels. Our clients are hugely demanding of volume for us. They want us to deliver on time, right, to the customer and with the right price, delivery, and quality. And really making sure that we make things as simple as possible for these suppliers and from a fatigue perspective so they can focus on it. And one thing we're also learning is before we even get into supplier engagement, which is really the second pain point. So outside that data collection and the fatigue, which software can definitely help with, and I can walk through a little bit more on that. The engagement piece is absolutely key with these suppliers, right? Like I said, don't have time to do this. They don't have sustainability programs. They don't have sustainability teams. We're working a lot with small, medium-sized businesses with facilities managers or energy buyers, right? That may not have the expertise. One thing we're finding, as you can see here in these programs, and I'll walk through these in the slide coming up here, Vish, if you want to slide to the next one, to kind of walk through a timeline. But one thing that we learned early is you can see we manage between 8 or 9 different programs today. And starting from the left all the way to the right is some of the earlier ones are on the left side that we started a couple of years ago. One of the things that we really found was, hey, we're not getting the supply engagement we want, right? And maybe 40, 50, 60%, which isn't bad, right? When it comes down to it. But what we found was a lot of the category management teams within these large multinationals didn't know how to talk sustainability. They didn't know how to talk decarbonization actions, right? They didn't even know what scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 were. How do we expect our suppliers that are providing us goods and materials from a large multinational, how do we expect them to take action if their main category manager isn't able to speak the same language that we are holding them accountable for, right? So specifically within Energize program, I can walk through this as an example. It's with our top 21 pharmaceutical companies. We band together with them and we decarbonize their upstream supply chain or their value chain partners. We do this because they share the same suppliers. So if we help decarbonize one of those suppliers within our value chain, majority of those Energize sponsors within the pharmaceutical supply chain are going to feel that benefit from a scope 3 perspective. Well, we were looking at the supplier engagement piece, which is that main pain point. And we were having conversations and one of the sponsors recommended, Dave, maybe we should take a look at educating our procurement teams. Great idea. You know what? Good point. I spent 12 years in procurement. And if you were to tell me to go drive sustainability within my supply chain today, and I was not a sustainable procurement professional, I'd have a hard time communicating that. So we held a training for the Energize sponsors and all the category teams, and we had over 500 category teams from those pharmaceutical sponsor companies sign up. Really just walking them through basics like science-based targets, how to set a target, what does a roadmap look like, what are your renewable energy options, what is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. After doing that within that program for Energize, we saw a huge uptick in that supplier engagement because we had those category teams really telling the story on the front lines and they were speaking to it, right? And we talk a ton in these programs about, hey, we've set goals as a large multinational scope 3. We really would love to decarbonize our supply chain. We're going to look at different ways to incentivize them. Well, a lot of companies have goals coming up in 2030, which is not too far away. So we're almost seeing within the market today some large multinationals moving from that, hey, it's nice to have, it's an incentive. We set this goal for 2030. It's now becoming, hey, Dave, let's get a little bit targeted. Let's get a little more approachable with our suppliers. I want to understand what supplier is engaging, what training they're taking, how they're engaging, but really I want to understand which ones aren't, right? And I want to put together plans in place to go out there and drive re-engagement with those suppliers. So we're seeing a little bit move from kind of incentivizing our suppliers and having a nice to have, just like Vishnu mentioned in the first few slides of this, is it's moving more towards it's a must have. It's becoming a little bit of a table stakes conversation within some regions of the world or within some industries, that it's right up there in your potentially RFP process with costs or price of the product, delivery, quality, inventory levels. We are now talking carbon pricing, is more chatted about within, especially the European region. So there's a time that's going to come, and it's coming upon us now. These suppliers are going to need the help. They're going to need the engagement. They're going to need a simple value prop end in mind. Software can deliver that. And they're going to need to be able to tell their large multinational clients a story of their journey of how they're decarbonizing their operations. You can't do that without software, right? Not at all. So I think that's just a little bit, Vishnu, kind of working into some of the things that we see within these programs. It's continuing to be cognizant of that supplier fatigue, educating our own procurement teams to be able to deliver the consistent, simple message to these suppliers about what the end in mind is. And then we get into the education piece. So that's really kind of what we do within the programs that we run today. And you can see on the screen, I'll walk through them. We bring them in as suppliers, we register, and we begin to educate them and learn about them. Like I mentioned, onboarding them, which is a little bit of a heavy lift, but really we bake all those onboardings back into the contextual maturity of those suppliers, understanding where they at, and then really helping them guide their journey to take the decarbonization action. So a couple different programs that we run today. So across the top are consortium style approaches. So mainly Energize, Catalyze, they're pharmaceutical and semiconductor. We're working with the top companies within each of those regions to really understand their upstream supply networks, both tier one, digging into tier two, because these suppliers all supply the same companies, right? So that fatigue piece, these consortium programs that we have today is, hey, we have one consistent message to 21 different Energize or pharmaceutical sponsors going to one supplier, right? Catalyze, we have 7 different semiconductor companies now. We're creating consistent messaging to single suppliers for those 7 companies, right? And then Renewway and Materialize are 2 others that are launching now around air and defense and natural resources. Materialize is interesting because we're going back to the raw material piece, right, for natural resources. And then on the bottom line is companies that have real goals, that have real scope 3 goals that need to hit their scope 3 reduction. So really working with those companies to really drive engagement with their suppliers, understand and learn about them. And then based on their footprint, their electrical load, their maturity, the size of their location, we start introducing potentially education segmented off ramps to them. And we do that through software, right? And learning about these companies, onboarding them into our educational platforms. And then we really have the ability to view real time their engagement about what trainings they're taking, where they're engaged, how they're engaged, to really expedite their journey to take action. As Vishnu mentioned, that is the absolute key that we all must drive. Is understanding where they can take action within these programs. Because if we're not driving action within our supply base today, then there's going to be no improvement. We're going to continue to collect data, paint a very rosy picture, try to engage and try to educate. But if we're not really helping these suppliers take action and giving them the acute, targeted, direct opportunities that make the most sense for them, then I think we're all failing, right? So really, that's the main piece that we have in this, and software can be a huge part in that. So, I mean, I think what's also interesting is everyone's very curious about network effect within scope 3. So you can see there in the lower left-hand corner, this is real data with some of our programs. You can see the supply lines that are being back-built by some of the programs that if we, not only within Energize, a pharmaceutical industry, or Catalyze, or maybe our own zero carbon program, we're starting to see different industries and different industry programs share the same suppliers. So we have packaging suppliers that touch multiple different programs, right? So I think it's really powerful that as we start baking into that scope 3 journey and having that visibility within different tiers through software, we have a very targeted approach within hotspots to help those specific companies to reduce the overall scope 3 actions. So, so just kind of an overview of the programs. I will say there's a lot of demand out there for programs and for assistance with the scope 3 journey. If we get into the next slide a little bit, I want to go through two quick case studies, right? There's Schneider's zero carbon program. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I think it's a really aggressive goal. Our internal team and Christophe Quincampoix and his team have really, if you talk about a supply chain decarbonization program, you would probably look them up as they would be one of the best practices, right? So they're really targeting 100 or 1,000 of their top suppliers within Schneider today to decarbonize their operations overall from a scope 1 and scope 2 perspective by 50% by the end of 2025, right? I don't know if there's anybody else in the globe that has this goal, and it takes a lot. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of lift, it takes a lot of bandwidth, a lot of planning. Not only that, but to run these types of programs within a supply chain decarbonization framework, you absolutely have to have C-level buy-in. It's a non-negotiable to table stake, right? So this is really ingrained within Schneider's metrics, within their goals, employee ratings. This entire program, everybody owns it, and it starts from the top level at the C-level suite, right? So that's another absolute key that we have to say is if you got the CFO, CEO, COO buy-in, that's really where it starts. And how do we tell that story to help decarbonize our suppliers to get to where we all need to be by a certain time? So I think that's really powerful. We could probably follow up with this afterwards, but there's a ton of road mapping around this, and even Christophe has even published a kind of a cheat sheet for your decarbonization roadmap for this program. So pretty powerful. So that's a direct program. The next one, Vishnu, a little bit here, just to share some context, is the Energize program, like I mentioned. And I'll tell you, these programs, they catch fire, right? Usually it starts with one or two companies raising their hand, right, and saying, Dave, this is interesting. We want to start doing a industry-wide. We all share the same suppliers. Let's really streamline this. Let's communicate effectively. Let's reduce that fatigue, and let's drive deep engagement and have common goals. Energize started with 2-3 companies, quickly moved to 10. It's been in process now about 2.5 years. And now it's 21 different sponsors. We have sponsors joining all the time. So it's very interesting, right? And people are saying, well, I need to get on that, right? They're driving nice metrics, they're driving constant communication and goals within the market. But this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, you could start thinking about creating industry guidelines, white papers, all the suppliers that have any type of, direct material supply lines into this. I mean, it could be guided by this entire organization, this industry, which is now called Energize. So it's pretty neat. If you want to go out there and take a look at it, right now, the journeys for these suppliers, and I will be completely transparent with you. This is another kind of takeaway: is never be afraid to start your scope 3 journey. Start now, right? If I could have told people to start yesterday, I would have said the same thing. When I was in procurement, 2.5 years ago, before I joined our sustainability business, I wish I would have started back then as a category manager talking about this. Start now, because a lot of the journey that we have within these programs, it takes you 6, 12, 18 months, sometimes minimum, to really start bringing these suppliers through that educational engagement platform by way of software, and then also off-ramping them for self-service or SaaS platforms that they can use for small, medium-sized businesses too. I would say if we didn't have software today, we didn't have that education engagement platform or off-ramp for a solution provider network to help these suppliers when they're ready to take action, this would take years, right? I mean, we've already shrunk that cycle time down from about 18 months to about 12 months, and sometimes 6 months for some off-ramps for some of these suppliers to take action. That's all through software, right? So I think it's really powerful. I just want to kind of share some context. Me and my team are in this day in and day out with suppliers, talking with the small and medium-sized businesses, understanding the pressures that are coming from investors into the large multinationals, the pressures that are even growing among sustainable procurement teams to deliver actions. And then that pressure rolls proverbially downhill to those small and medium-sized businesses to be able to take the action to keep the clients happy, meet those scope 3 goals, but ultimately, like I mentioned before, I think there's going to be a time in the next year or two, possibly within specific regions, where if you're not decarbonizing your operations as a small and medium-sized business, you're going to potentially lose business or not have the ability to grow your business organically within those clients. So I think that time is coming. We feel it. We see it in the tea leaves out there in the future. So that's why we all kind of need to start now and band together on this. Okay. And then Vishnu, I think we have, yeah, so this is, I think this is kind of interesting. I wanted to share a roadmap of the supplier journey a little bit, all right? And you're, kind of raising like, Dave, all right, well, this is great. This is amazing. Good job. Let's talk about what this really means to the supplier. How do they feel, going through the journey? So we try to keep it very simple, right? That program registration piece, when we take a little bit about this, the fatigue is real. We ask them a very targeted set of questions, right, that they can answer probably in 5 or 10 minutes and be done, right? Because one of the biggest barriers to supplier engagement that we are seeing today is the lack of resources and the ability for them to fill out questionnaires, the expertise to have that questionnaires and maturity around that. So we keep it very, very simple. And I mean, there's even software today, that we utilize as well at Schneider that you can even take pictures of your heat, energy, and gas bills, and then automatically uploads them into software, right? So by taking a picture on your phone, you're creating your own glide path, right? Rather than implementing these things within a spreadsheet. At that point, you begin to learn about these suppliers, how they register, what questions they answer. This entire process within, the software of the engagement platform is how do we really learn about them? How do we differentiate them from others? Because like Vishu said, no two suppliers are equal. They're all different. They're all different industries. They're all different categories. They're different locations, sizes, maturities. That's one thing that is absolutely key around the engagement piece is these programs have to be global, right? So I was in sourcing for 8 or 9 years within procurement, right? Globally as well. Majority of the operations may be in North America, Europe, but a lot of the suppliers are not in those regions, right? So we've got to have the ability to have multilingual approach, understanding what really resonates within those specific regions for off-ramps. And today we do specific training around regionals as well, which may be for LATAM or it may be for I don't know, Indonesia or France. There's different types of opportunities within different regions. So really understanding the supplier onboarding piece. If you think you're going to raise your hand and solve everything by software, good luck. You can try to, but it's not going to happen. Is it going to help you? Absolutely. Right. But there's also going to be that piece where we drive engagement, and that's that second step there, supplier onboarding, where we really spend some time with suppliers to understand what resonates, what context, what pains they're feeling. And we understand this to kind of expedite them through the process. And you can do the same by having that conversation. But it also, we take that context and bake it back into improving how we supply, how we engage these suppliers and continuously improve and understand what's happening in the market. That third piece is all about software, right? Loading them onto a educational platform, which is very targeted. It has an approach to them that that would resonate. And then it's really not just an LMS system. It's really bringing on live webinars, having experts and having suppliers gain access to those experts and ask real-time questions within multiple languages and focus on different regions. And I would say the real power that is within these live webinars is they are experts and they're bringing the most latest up-to-speed knowledge on certain things. Like even in renewables right now, we're talking about tax credit transfers, right? With some of the headwinds you see in the power purchase market. So, I mean, dynamically changing, bringing new experts into that educational platform is something that really resonates with a lot of these suppliers, but keeping it very, very, very simple. You really have to understand and put on the small, medium-sized business hat as eyes wide open. If this was brought to me, how would that resonate and how do we communicate that? The communication and simplicity is absolutely key. And you kind of see as we go down through the journey, and this journey 1 through 5 can take anywhere from 6 to 18 months for some suppliers, right? So, we start understanding, okay, here's your engagement, here's where you're spending time, here's where you're pegged to maturity. This is probably out of the 15 different off-ramps we have for decarbonization, these 3 are going to make the best sense. Software helps to tell us that by learning about these suppliers, learning about where they're at, providing them I would say, the shortest path, the path with the best ROI, and the path with the most impact, be able to take action on the back end. Okay. And then step 5 there is really implement. So as Vishnu mentioned, through the fatigue and the engagement and the data collection piece, we really want to drive the action, right? Within our programs today, I feel that if we're not driving action, then they're failures, right? We need to make sure that we're driving action with those suppliers. So I think overall, I think it's a very interesting journey, and this journey changes, right, all the time. So it's very dynamic, and we really bake that into different processes and different feedback that we get throughout the program. Okay, and I think there's one last one here. I just want to kind of wrap this up, and I know I wanted to leave a good 15 minutes for questions here in the end if there are any, but keep it very simple. I talked about the fatigue piece. I talked about the engagement piece. I think there's going to be a lesson learned on getting out there and educating your category teams, right? And really having them own the conversation with those suppliers because they own the commercial relationship with those suppliers, and those suppliers are going to listen, right? But also as category managers, like Vishnu said earlier, let's not just work with the sales account or the account executive. Let's start asking the difficult questions. Let's start kicking off sessions with QBRs with suppliers or monthly meetings with suppliers. Let's get to different levels within their organization that really, I would say, have the authority and knowledge, not only as a front end sales that you're dealing with as a category manager, but understanding what is your decarbonization plan? Do you have a sustainable procurement team? What is your roadmap? How can we help you? Front-end category managers and category buyers really have to start asking those deeper questions within their suppliers to get around the account executive and to get within different pillars or different leaderships within those suppliers. That's where the engagement will rise up. Okay, that is one of the keys. So we talk about this here, really pain point for SMEs or small, medium-sized enterprises. In my business back in the day in procurement, I was always subject matter experts, but SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises we're talking about here. The maturity is real. We can be talking to a large multinational client that's larger than Schneider within a supply chain, or we could be talking to a small packaging supplier in Fort Wayne, Indiana that has a 10,000 square foot facility, but has supplier, fatigue of 50 companies asking him or her to go drive their emissions down, right? So the maturity is all over the board. Being able to peg that, understand that, ask the right questions, and then being able to be, I would say, very simple in the approach of how do you work with that maturity to guide them to proper action. One of the biggest barriers that we'll talk about ever from a supplier perspective is cost, right? This does not go away at all. So when I talk about carbon pricing and baking carbon pricing potentially into your RFP at some point in the future years, this is going to be something that's going to be, okay, maybe there is a little bit of cost to decarbonize, but I don't want to lose 30% of my business with this client, right? So cost is always going to be a factor. And really, I think one of the keys around the programs that are run today or the engagement that we have is you want all this engagement, all the data collection and maturity to be free of cost to the small and medium-sized business. They're operating on razor-thin margins. The procurement goal is to reduce costs every single year at these suppliers, right? That is really what majority of procurement professionals are judged on outside of quality and delivery. So they already have razor-thin margins as is, right? So they are going to be very, very, very sensitive to any costs associated with decarbonizing, right? So you really want to get them through that educational platform, engage them, and then be transparent about what that cost or ROI is potentially based on their off-ramp of what they potentially need. And then resources, like I talked about, I mentioned earlier, facilities managers, energy buyers. I think that maturity piece and the resources piece go hand in hand, right? There's no doubt about it. So I think it's one of those things where if we're early on maturity process or a certain size, the resources may not be there, right? So it's going back to that simple message, communicating the ROI and really the why we're doing these types of things. And then also one more thing that isn't on here, a lot of small, medium-sized businesses are very, very concerned about disruption to their own operations. Trying to get product out to their clients, trying to get product out to meet demand of an ever demanding and increasing forecast that they have on their customers. The last thing they want to do is potentially tear down a boiler or create something on their shop floor that is going to disrupt their operations, right? So as we're talking to these suppliers, really having the understanding of, hey, let's understand where your pain points are at and making sure that we're not disrupting your operations and within your glide path to help meet that target, which can be done through software, right? Let's identify and pick out those areas that are specific, that are not going to disrupt your operations, but are going to help you meet that goal. And then put mitigation plans in place long term to really, at a certain point within your marginal abatement curve, take some of those longer term programs and improvements and maybe plan for those a little bit later to help meet that goal. So, I mean, I think it's a nice mix of different pain points we feel. And then as a large multinational, one of the pain points is the large multinational just wants information and transparency and data on their suppliers that they can trust, right? And that doesn't come without the use of software. So, Vishnu, I think that's my last slide. We could open up to questions. I want to leave a few minutes left here. I haven't seen too many come in, but just kind of want to share some pain points outside of the software piece that Vishnu shared earlier. Lessons learned, right? And what can you take away from this webinar to be like, yeah, I haven't thought about that, or that's a pain point for us as well, Dave. Let's talk about how we overcome that barrier.
So while we wait for questions to come in, I want to emphasize that point about engagement. With a lot of supply chain programs, they don't have the luxury of mandating it from the suppliers, right? So maybe if you're one of the world's largest phone companies, you can get away with saying, hey, if you're making even the tiniest component that goes into one of my phones, that factory needs to be 100% renewable. You could pull that off if you have that kind of clout with your suppliers, but the truth of the matter is most companies don't, right? And so most supply chain programs are very much influencing without authority, right? You're approaching your suppliers and saying, hey, you could fully say no to this and not do anything if you want to, but I really want you to do something with this, right? And so you're approaching with engagement in mind. And so it's very important that the supplier's engagement is constantly monitored. And that's where, again, software makes a big difference, because software is the prism through which suppliers experience your supply chain program, right? And it has to be designed in a way that makes it easy for them to use. It has to be simple, like Dave said. It can't be complex. Your software cannot seem like a plane's cockpit where they enter and they're like, I don't know what all of this does, and I have no idea how to engage with this, right? So it's very important that each supplier in your program feels engaged. And this is something that we've seen directly when interacting with our own suppliers in our own supply chain program, which again, the 1,000 that Dave mentioned in the Zero Carbon Project, it's a little over 1,000. And all of those, every single one of those suppliers are volunteers. They've volunteered to join the program. So when we were speaking to our own suppliers and saying, hey, so what is your experience in our supply chain program, say, compared to other supply chain programs, just making conversation. One of the consistent pieces of feedback that we get from our suppliers is, look, every supply chain program typically has some kind of software attached to it. The difference is what the software does. In most supply chain programs, the software is about take, or at least that's the way it feels to suppliers, because it's like, hey, give me this, give me this, give me this. And it's all about making that as effective as possible. It's almost like a repo agent, right? And so there's a difference between software that feels like that and software that's also helping you. So the difference is if you ask for information and make it easy for them to give you that information, and then once they've given you that information, you also help them understand what they can do with that information to improve their own position, that's more likely to increase engagement, because at that point it feels like a give and take with your suppliers. It doesn't feel as extractive for them, and they're more likely to stay engaged in your supply chain program. And without that, the risk is that you have this big bang supply chain program, a lot of excitement in the first month, and then 6 months later it's complete crickets, right? And so it makes a big difference. So question, does software provide decarbonization project toolboxes depending on the supplier industry? Absolutely. Good software should understand what segment or industry a specific supplier is operating in. And it's not just about the supplier, because remember, you could have a supplier that has, I don't know, 10 office buildings, 5 factories, and 3 service depots or warehouses, right? And so you can't approach the situation with a company view. You almost have to approach the situation with a site view. Which specific sites of the supplier company are kind of connected to your scope 3? And to answer the question, absolutely. Depending on what type of site it is, whether it's a warehouse, whether it's a manufacturing facility, if it's an office building, each one will have a different set of decarbonization actions that are best suited for the target that the supplier is trying to hit, right? So if your supply chain program's target is 100% renewable, that looks different in a manufacturing facility versus a warehouse versus an office building, right? And so I think the question is spot on. You do need software that provides different recommendations for different industries or different site types of each of your suppliers.
Yeah, no, Vishnu, thank you for that. And I think the second one there I'll take as well, and maybe you could take a look at the third one there from Monica that came in. How do you drive supplier conformity participation? I mean, incentives versus penalties. What have you seen? So it's like the old carrot versus stick approach. And I would say the basis to this question really is understanding the pressure, right? I mean, I would say when we work with many, many different companies today, depending on the investor pressure that I was talking about, how they're feeling that pressure coming down, or do they have scope 3 goals, and do they need to hit them by certain dates? Do they have a goal? What's the date? What's the investor pressure they're feeling, right? It helps us really understand do we have enough time, or do we want to incentivize these suppliers? And there's multiple different opportunities to incentivize suppliers out there, payment terms, ROI, investment within them to help decarbonize those actions, or do you penalize them? Right? You start baking the price of their carbon emissions footprint into their actual RFP process. We see both, right? And I think what we're seeing now from an engagement perspective is once you move a little bit from that incentivized piece, and that's a nice to have, it definitely is voluntary. But as you start baking it into your supplier sourcing matrix or your handbooks, and there's a lot of companies doing that nowadays, within the market, we have seen an uptick within that supplier engagement and action as you become a little bit more crystal clear communicating with your suppliers that, hey, that's not only this is a nice to have anymore, this is becoming an expectation. And by doing that, to create goals on your suppliers, say, I want 40% of my suppliers to have an SBTI target by a certain date. I want to bake it into my supplier sourcing handbook. This is a must non-negotiable within our next negotiation. We're seeing that happen, and suppliers are definitely raising their hand a little bit more to become engaged, educated through specific software platforms, and then on the back end to be able to understand what opportunities they do have. So it's swinging always, but we see a little bit more in the European region. It's a little bit further ahead within that pendulum, swinging more towards a, not penalized, but more towards a pressure loaded approach towards those suppliers. So good question.
The next question is, developing supplier-specific data is quite costly and resource-intensive for manufacturers. How do we influence smaller suppliers to develop this data? So I want to take a second to think about why it can get expensive. So if you, for example, take a supply chain program with, say, 300 suppliers spread all over the globe, and the manufacturer or the supply chain parent in this case is approaching this manually, it can get very expensive because you're looking at disparate sets of data calculated through different methodologies with different understandings of what's needed. So when you get that data dump, getting that data manually is going to take a lot of time. Processing that data manually is going to take a lot of time. And then the follow-up, because the data is not going to be good enough, is also going to take a lot of time. And so usually when people think of expense, what they forget is the alternative is to do all of this manually or without software, or kind of say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to make software tools available to my suppliers. I'll just send them emails asking them for information and then manually process it. That is the one that really gets expensive. And so the benefit that software can provide is it can save you almost up to half the amount of manual hours that you'd have to put into these supply chain programs if you were to deploy software. And the benefit of that software, especially like your question suggested, the biggest benefit in terms of scale is the number of suppliers you can cover, including the smaller ones that it would get expensive. So if you have 100 suppliers and your approach is, okay, I can't go manual because that's going to take too long. I'm going to spend money, but not on software. I'm just going to hire a bunch of consultants. That also can get expensive because if you have to cover all 100 suppliers with consultants, they're awesome, but they're expensive, right? And so software is like a happy medium. In effect, it's not as cheap. It's not as cheap as it can get, but it's also not as expensive as doing it manually or using consultants. And so I call it the sweet spot, right? Like you get exactly the right level of bang for your buck for the amount that you spend in comparison to the number of suppliers that you have in your I'm sorry, I'm looking at the next question. What metrics does Zygo process? So it's a very good question. So in Zygo, for example, our software, if you were to use it for your own supply chain program, the same piece of software is going to, on one side, help suppliers come up with the data, give and you educate them and collect the information and give them assistance on what to do. And on the other side, it's also going to report metrics or summarize data back up to the supply chain parent, so that the same single software can be used for the entire supply chain program. Now, in this type of application, what you as the supply chain parent or the manufacturer would see are metrics like scope 1 emission from your supplier, scope 2 emissions from your suppliers, total scope 3 emissions, what percentage of those scope 3 emissions is your responsibility or allocated to you. You could understand supplier engagement of, hey, what are my suppliers doing? Are they actually consuming the educational content? Which educational content are they consuming? Which ones are not engaging? Some of, like, if you have like a few that haven't logged in since the program started, they're clearly disengaged. How can you engage them, right? You should have ways in which you can nudge them to say, hey, look, you volunteered, you signed up for this, and now you're not doing anything. Maybe, get back in the game or something like that. So all of these are metrics that a good software, Zygo included, would track.
And Vishnu, I know we have a couple more.
Yeah, a few more. Yeah.
I'll take that third one. The top two are kind of talking about reporting. So if you want to read those top two, but I mean, the third one here is our suppliers run the gamut from sophisticated to unsophisticated as it relates to decarb approach. Does Schneider account for this in their education materials and decarb roadmaps, or is it one size fits all? So I would say it depends. Usually what we do within our educational platforms today is we partner with a large multinational, understand where their hotspots are at, what work they've done, what data they've collected, understand a little bit about their supplier maturity. But then as they really get onboarded into our educational platforms, we start very basic. We do like a decarbonization 101, RE 101, different off ramps to really understand, hey, we're going to educate the larger group, right? And as we learn about them, as we onboard them, and some of the questions that they answer, we then start prioritizing and understanding there are different off-ramps that they could take that get more granular and more dedicated approach. So, for example, some of our earlier programs that started were mainly around renewable energy and power purchase agreements. So one off-ramp that we have today is a 6-level deep dive session for how do I do a power purchase agreement as a supplier, right? So we have a 101 series, which kind of hits it all. And then we start learning about them and guiding them towards different areas of opportunity that they may have to learn about that, and getting different stakeholders engaged from different supplier companies to make sure that we have cross-functional support for that supplier when they take action. So great question. I would say every program's a little bit different that we run today. But we start out pretty high level, understanding that maturity, and then guide them to some other segmented approach that might make more sense for them to hit the goals they need. Okay.
We've got a question around allocation. So the question is basically, if you have a supplier that makes, let's say, 100 products, and they supply you with only 10 of the 100, how do you kind of calculate the percentage of emissions that come to you? Because you don't want emissions for all 100 that they manufacture coming to you, because you don't buy all 100, right? And so there's largely two methodologies or approaches that are taken in the industry to calculate this particular ratio, which sometimes is called allocation, is what percentage of the supplier's emissions falls under your scope 3, right? And so there's two ways to calculate that. The most easiest one to understand, but the hardest one to do, is product carbon footprinting. So basically, for each product, you have to calculate the carbon footprint for each product that the supplier makes. And then you just multiply the number of products that you buy from that supplier to get your kind of allocation. So if each thing is 10 tons of carbon and you buy 10 of those things, then that's 100 tons of carbon. That's the relationship between you and your supplier. Now, this is very easy to understand, but it's super hard to pull off, because product carbon footprinting is very in-depth. It's different for different sectors. It's very tedious to calculate. I mean, there are one-click product carbon footprint tools out there, but again, if you think explaining scope 1, 2, and 3 is hard to a supplier, explaining product carbon footprinting is a master's degree. It's a whole different level of complexity. That some segments it's the only choice you have, but from our experience, most companies are not going in that direction because they understand the complexity if they proceed in that direction. So what we see being more popular is the spend-based calculation, which looks at the expenditure that you have with a supplier. So if there's a supplier that let's say generates $100 of revenue every year to all the suppliers that they supply, and you only spend $10 with them, then that's how you do the calculation is, okay, I'm responsible for 10% of their emissions. And so that's more popular in most supply chain programs, is that kind of spend-based calculation. But largely there are two, with the second one being more popular. There was another question around carbon credit tracking specific to electrical power. This is also a very interesting question. So there's a concept called a utility stack, right? And so basically any part of the world, the electricity that you consume is made up of electricity produced from different sources. So it could be 10% coal, 30% nuclear, 5% solar, and all of that kind of comes together and is blended into the electrons that basically supply your office, right? And so every site, every supplier, everyone has a specific type of makeup of your utility stack. And there are two methods to understand or estimate that utility stack. There's what's called a location-based calculations, and there's market-based calculations. So location-based calculation is a method where, for example, if you take one country and you don't have the utility stack for every single electrical power provider in that country, what you do is you take an average for that country in general. So for the country of XYZ, on average, they're about 10% coal, 10% solar, and 10% this. And therefore, that is the emission factor calculation, or the factor calculation. In some other countries, you may have actual information about the specific companies that provide electricity. So you could go, electricity provider A is 100% renewable, electricity provider B is 50-50. And so if you know that, you factor that in to the calculation. So it depends on the preferences of the customer. It depends on the availability of the data, but there are different methods in which that dynamic that you just mentioned is accounted into the carbon calculations.
And real quick, one more question before you, Jessica. I know we're over time, but the supplier fatigue, I'm passionate about that. And can you leverage data that's used by other providers? Yes, that is a point. So we have conversations all the time with other providers to be able to, build upon that data. You just need to be careful about GDPR and understand terms and conditions around those. So be very careful about that. But yes.
Wonderful. Well, I didn't even get a chance to ask the questions that I wanted to ask you guys today, which is a good thing. That means we had a large amount of participation from today's audience. I feel like we could do a full just Q&A session on this on this topic with both of you to continue answering questions. But I do want to thank, the team at Schneider for putting together such a thoughtful presentation and providing such incredible insights into the platform, as well as just good business practices and being transparent. I think that's something that we cannot ever say enough of, is really the transparency factor here. So if you have additional questions, please feel free to share them with the team. And we're already getting some feedback from our attendees today on this webinar, which is wonderful. So I know this is not going to be the last time that we will have to work together, and I want to thank everybody for being on with us. We had truly a global audience on from all over the world today, so that was wonderful to see. And again, thank you for being actively engaged in today's event. And to Vishnu and David, thank you again for your time. So I hope everyone has a wonderful day, and don't worry, this will be available on demand to watch again. So have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, we are clear. All right.
Good.
Yeah, great. I mean, I love the questions that came in.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised that they all started like spewing at the very end. That's usually what happens.
Yeah, usually one comes in and then the rest kind of fall in
Yes.
afterwards. Okay, great. Well, thank you for all your prep, and thank you for getting that rolling. So it was very seamless. I appreciate it.
Of course, and hopefully we'll get to work together soon again.
All right. Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks, Jessica.
Enjoy the day.